Record. All right. So let's see if we're recording. All right. Hey everyone. Welcome to our final writing workshop of the semester. This one's going to notably be a bit shorter. I'm just going to go overall focus on the structure of our discussion and abstract. And at this point, I do want to remind you all that this is going to be recorded and also that you have that full draft of the paper uh, due on reading day. Also, we're doing a new full draft peer review due next Wednesday night. I'll send out some information about that on ELC. But if you have a completed draft, you can do a peer review with someone else who has a draft. All right, so as I said, this is the last writing workshop of the semester. My name is Riley Thoen, and today we're going to be focusing on the abstract and discussion sections of your research papers. I just wanted to remind you to please reach out to me if you have any questions about writing, if you want to schedule a writing conference, anything of that nature. And as a last reminder, your research paper is due reading day at midnight for biology research, independent research. Okay. Another quick reminder I want to note is that there's an undergraduate writing retreat this Sunday. That is Sunday, November 10th, from 3 to 7 p.m. in the reading room of the Miller Learning Center. There'll be refreshments, snacks, food, etc. Basically, it's a writing retreat. It's a good time. You just go to a room, and there's good lighting in that room, I'll note. And you get to write with a number of basically other people who are motivated to doing the same thing as you are. Anytime I've gone to a writing retreat, it's been extremely motivating and I've gotten a ton done. So I really enjoy a good writing retreat, and I recommend signing up for this writing retreat if you can. There's also a note in ELC with the link to sign up for it. Also, this is a great opportunity to work on your final paper draft to submit a draft to the peer review. All right. So let's get going. So today we're going to discuss primarily the discussion and abstract sections of your required research paper. And the abstract section basically is an overall summary of your research paper. It emphasizes the highlights of your study. The discussion, on the other hand, is kind of the big final section we haven't yet talked about. But this section basically revisits your hypotheses and the objectives you outline in the introduction, and then highlights your findings and how kind of you fill in that gap of knowledge that you identified in the introduction, and how it moves the field forward. So far this semester, you all have done tons of work to collect data, analyze data, read papers, make figures, etc. And while that data that you've collected and that knowledge you've collected is a good backbone, you need to make sure you are interpreting that data. And in the discussion, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be interpreting the data in context of other literature and also of the results. So speaking of the results, just a reminder, in the results, we report our results objectively. So this is going to include in figure form as well as in a written results form. And in the discussion section, we interpret those results basically in a broader context of literature. We say what they mean for our field, what they mean for science, and what are the large overall implications of those results. Okay, so let's talk about what that interpretation of the discussion looks like in the context of a paper. So if we harken back to our overall scientific paper flow, we get this kind of hourglass figure here, where in the introduction section, specifically, we start really broad, motivating why our research is important. Then we get specific into our questions, materials and methods, results, and then our discussion, where we essentially, revisit the introduction as we just talked about. But specifically zooming in on this introduction, if we remember back sometime to our introduction workshop, the introduction follows this inverted pyramid shape. Basically, there's three different components of the introduction: contextualizing, conceptualizing, and then resolving. And here's what that specifically means. So we start off really general by referencing the broad literature and trying to motivate our research question. Basically saying, why does this question matter? Why should you be interested in it? Then in the introduction, we're still contextualizing, saying what we know about your specific research question. This is what's known about this thing, and therefore I'm going to ask this question, which is one aspect, but we don't know about it. So the next aspect of the introduction is conceptualizing, as I just said, where we identify a gap in knowledge, basically say what we don't know. And then lastly, we resolve our introduction. We say how we're going to actually address that gap in our knowledge. What are the hypotheses? What are the questions you're answering? So this is the introduction, again, of a paper. And if we go back to our hourglass, we can see that the discussion is essentially the opposite of that. It's a mirror image. So basically, it's an introduction flipped on its head where we start really specific, basically resolving, and then we get more general, giving the broad implications of our results. So the first part of that in the discussion is going to be resolving. In this case, what we're doing is basically starting our discussion off by restating our objectives and also restating the findings that we had in our results, summarizing them quickly, essentially. Next in your discussion, you should work on conceptualizing. So this is basically saying how you actually, filled your knowledge gap that you identified in the conceptualizing part of the introduction. And at that same point, we also talk about how we came to that conclusion, how we filled that knowledge gap based on our results and also other literature. And we may also discuss some limitations here at this point. And then lastly, we contextualize. So this is where we relate our results to other literature. Say, was our results similar to other studies that asked a similar question? Were they different? Why were they? And then you also talk about the broad implications at this point. So what does this mean for society? And also how does this advance the field of science? So in summary, our results or discussion section should have a resolution where we restate the objectives and findings, conceptualization where we draw a conclusion and note support for that conclusion in our data and other studies, and contextualize where we talk about the implications and bring in other studies as well to compare our results to. And I'll note this here, and I'll come back to it later, but the discussion is arranged like this pyramid, normal right side up pyramid. You may have a few different sections of your discussion section where you do this a few times, where you maybe have subsections where you break down one result, then you break down another result and talk about, implications of each of those results separately. Okay, so let's talk about the kind of nitty-gritty of what goes into a discussion section. What are the tidbits that we want to put into each one of these aspects? So first things first is going to be talking about kind of a language thing, but it does have an important aspect to the rest of the discussion. So when we make hypotheses, the way that we test an hypothesis, and if we see that our hypothesis is supported, one thing we don't want to say is that our hypothesis is, proven. We don't want to speak in absolutes. So a significant result that supports a hypothesis is support. Essentially, it's not proof. One result doesn't mean something is absolutely true. And in your discussion, if you speak in absolutes, that's going to be flagged by reviewers. So in your discussion, you want to say things that are maybe less absolute, but for instance, things like these results suggest or indicate, or this may represent, rather than this is proof that this hypothesis is true. Because it was true in this context, was supported in this context, but it may not be true in other contexts, or may not be supported in other contexts. Okay, so as for other aspects of the guideline, as we just talked about, you want to make sure you use, explicit language that's not black or white when talking about your hypothesis. Next, in your discussion, you're going to be using the present tense mostly, except when you're actually recounting your results. So when you're recounting your results, basically saying, we found this, you want to say that in past tense because that already happened. But the rest of the discussion should be in present tense. Next, in your discussion, you should be making claims. So essentially, you should be interpreting your data and deriving conclusions about the process or the organism that you're studying. This is going to mean looking at specific results in terms of like figures or parts of your results from your data, as well as other references to make certain claims about the biology of your organism or maybe your field as a whole. And then lastly, for this page at least, you want to discuss your findings in relation to previous work. Does your, do you see similar effects of a, drug on mouse motility, for instance, as this other drug someone studied? And in any capacity, would this change your implications or interpretations? All right, moving on. It's also important to acknowledge anomalous data in the discussion. So this may be things that are any sort of outliers or something that maybe doesn't align with your hypotheses you came out with. Perhaps you find a result that's not statistically significant, and that's all good. You still got to discuss it. You can't ignore it. It's still important, and it's still an interesting biological result or scientific result generally, because it means something in the wider context of biological systems, and it should be interpreted as such. This is sort of a something we talked about a little bit earlier with avoiding overreaching. So you just want to make sure that all of your interpretations are supported by some sort of evidence. And again, you're not speaking in absolutes. So this is going to be, so for instance, if your study examines efficacy of a disease treatment in mice, you want to establish that these findings were in a mouse model. And although it was potentially successful in a mouse model, we don't know if that specific disease treatment would work in humans. It might suggest that it would be positive for humans, but it's not an absolutely this is the cure for humans. You don't want to overreach in that perspective, and you don't want to, use language that's absolute. And then lastly, it's also important to discuss limitations in your study. Should be your limitations that you discuss should be limited to things such as aspects of the experimental design or data collection, something of that nature. All science is done by humans for the most part, but pretty much all science is done by humans. And so discussing human error as a limitation is not viable because all science has some component of human error in it. Okay. And then finally, at the end of your discussion, and kind of the big takeaway is that you always want to end your discussion by giving readers the big picture. Basically, give them the big, large-scale implications of your study. So first, you want to say how this research specifically advanced the field. What does this mean for other studies? What does this mean about our understanding of this system generally, this question generally? Next, you want to talk about any sort of broader impacts or applications of the research. Sometimes this is going to be pretty easy to find if you're studying the effects of drug treatment in mice. The application is pretty clear to potential drug treatments for humans. But other cases it may be less clear, but I will say that most all research has some sort of general societal impact. And then lastly, you also want to discuss any sort of future directions for your study. All right, so we're just going to highlight a section of a study from the discussion section. So I'm going to give you all a chance here to read a short excerpt from a discussion, and we're going to identify kind of some of how they outlined their discussion, how they organized it. All right, so I'll give you all maybe about a minute here to read this short section, maybe a part of a paragraph from a discussion from the Bezzarides paper, Bezzarides et al. 2007, and first ask you to identify their finding in this short excerpt. All right. So the findings that basically the recounting of the results are here in purple. So carotenoid content and red color of male and female elytra were not correlated with body harmony content. So essentially, this finding is just briefly restating the what they found in the results. At this time, sometimes people represent their objectives of the study at the same time as they're presenting their results in the discussion, basically recounting just what they did in general in this paper. It's just really important to restate your findings at the beginning of the discussion section or at the beginning of a subsection of the discussion so readers understand what your interpretation of your data is. Okay, so following up with that, let's take about 15, 20 seconds here, since you already read it, to find a sentence or sentences that interpret the findings. All right. So the interpretations of the findings are here in blue. There are these two middle sentences here. And you can kind of tell that these are the cases because they use language like this suggests. Again, they're not speaking in absolutes. They're saying this generally suggests. And then they basically provide the biological relevance of their findings. All right, following up on that, let's talk about the justification of their explanation. All right. So the justification is here at the end, now highlighted in green. So this is the type of thing that you'll hopefully aim to do in your discussion, and that is basically explaining what your results mean. They pulled in information from other papers here. They have citations here, and they use these to bolster their argument. Basically, describe other things that could be going on in terms of why they found this specific result. So again, this is the discussion section. The goal is to basically identify what your results mean overall. And while this is really a good simplified example, gives honestly a pretty good formula for how you could structure your whole discussion section or structure subsets of the discussion section. For instance, they're only talking about one result in this case, and maybe you have like 3 results and you do this 3 different times. Okay. Lastly, I do want to note here, give you all maybe a minute and a half to read this, talking about the way they discuss future directions and limitations in this study. Give you a chance to read this and identify those future directions and limitations. About a minute and a half. All right. So first, let's look for that area of future research. So they do a good job here. They note that there's first a really strong genetic component that they shouldn't overlook. And therefore, it's important to test studies similar to the ones described here with different color morphs of Harmonia. Great. Since there's a genetic component, they may not have captured everything. It's a great future direction. At that same time, they note that they have limitations here, that they only focus on this one color morph, which was because they focused on a specific region. So I think they do a good job of linking their future research and limitations here to actually have that future research specifically address a limitation of theirs in their study, that they only had a limited number of color morphs because they only sampled a specific region. Also, at this time, after this future directions limitations section, you may want to include something like a conclusion section where you're drawing overall conclusions from the research, basically talking about how your research moved the field forward. And then you also have an implications section at this time. So, what does your research mean for the broader literature, for society generally? All right. So, for this discussion, I do have a few tips before I move on to the abstract. The first one is that I recommend outlining your discussion section. It's really useful to just kind of like look at your, results one day, decide what they mean, and then plan out with an outline your discussion. What are the findings? What can you conclude from from the results? And what is the evidence of those conclusions? Then you can plan out your interpretations and ultimately the implications. Additionally, I really suggest breaking this discussion section into multiple different subsections for each of those main findings, each of those main results that you have in your paper. In this case, you'd basically be going through multiple of these different pyramids where you say an objective and then conceptualize, contextualize, and then you say restate another objective and finding, and then draw conclusions from that one again. And then you can have an overall conclusion at the end where you kind of bring everything together. As you maybe can tell at this point, the discussion section is really open for a lot of interpretation in the order you want to write it, but this is just what I find helpful. Okay, as for revising, when you are revising your discussion drafts, I think it's important to ask a few different questions. First, how did you explain the findings? Anything unexpected? What about hypotheses? Were they supported? Do you have any references? You should have references to justify that explanation. What are any sort of limitations that might have hindered your interpretation? What are future directions? And then lastly, I think the most important one, because people want to end reading your study with a big takeaway, what are the implications of your research? How did your study move the field forward? What does your study mean for society as a whole? So as a review, here's what we want to do in our discussion. First, resolve, restate the objectives and the findings, conceptualize, where you're supporting the conclusion and describing why we came to that conclusion, and contextualizing, which is where we relate our results to other literature and describe the implications and overall conclusions of them. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the abstract. As you know from reading papers during your background research, people often start reading papers by reading an abstract section. And abstracts are nice so that people have a general summary of a study, but ultimately, abstracts are helpful so you can read an abstract and understand whether or not a certain study is relevant to your research. So overall, abstracts are short, and they basically just provide the key details about your study, in a short summary, in a really narrative format. And usually the abstract should focus specifically on, the important overall takeaways, the scientific implications of your research, rather than getting into the, nitty-gritty details. Also, the abstract is a summary of the whole paper, everything that's important, so it should be written last. It's hard to write an abstract when you don't have results. So, considering that you should include that result in the abstract. All right. So for the abstract for the biology research paper, there's kind of four main sections of the abstract that correspond specifically to the four main sections of the scientific research paper. So first, the introduction part of the abstract, where we state the purpose and significance of the paper. This should probably be the longest overall section of your abstract. This is where you're really motivating people, trying to describe what you're going to be doing with your research, and you want to do it really briefly. This is the real hook of the abstract. Next, you briefly summarize your methodology without getting into the nitty-gritty details. You want to say, what is the overall approach you use to answer the question that you just identified? Next, you'll summarize the main finding or findings uh, of the results section, basically quickly stating what the main takeaway is from your results. And try to do this as objectively as possible without interpretation. Because at the end of your abstract, you will get a chance to give your overall main conclusions, your main takeaways from your paper. It's basically a really brief summary of the conclusions section of your research paper. And it's also worth noting any sort of broader impacts of the research paper as well at this point. Okay, so what's important to note, I think, as well, is that the abstract should focus specifically on really the narrative of your paper. So, what does your paper mean? How does it contribute to the broader pool of scientific knowledge? How does it contribute to society generally? That's what the abstract should be about. So, it really gets people hooked and interested in what you did. And of course, it's got to be accurate to your research, but it doesn't need to be chock full of details, talking about your sample sizes, your specific methods, etc. All right, so let's go through an example of a well-written abstract. So this is a modified abstract from the Lower and Hall paper that we've read for a few workshops this semester. As we read through, try to identify some of the different aspects of their work that are highlighted on the right side of the screen here. I'll give you 2 minutes here, or a minute and a half, 2 minutes here to just read through the abstract. We can sort of talk about how they organize it. All right, so let's talk about this abstract. So first, let's talk about the significance. So essentially the introduction in the abstract. Here, they have quite a bit. They first discuss, overall importance of genes underlying signal production and basically give overall motivation. And they talk about what is known and they identify a knowledge gap. Next, they do the methods and approach, where they discuss how they investigated sequence variation in luciferase. So again, this is a really short section just saying that we generally investigated this thing, not going into details on the nitty-gritty of the methods. Following up, they have a very short sentence for the main result. We found this main result, no coding variation essentially. And then lastly, they have a longer section for the major takeaways, which is, of course, one of the two main narrative categories here. So the significance of the intro and the discussion of the abstract are really the two areas that just take up kind of in my opinion, the most room within the abstract, because they're the ones that are really telling the story of your data, where you're really interpreting things and motivating it. Okay. So to wrap up this series, I just want to note that it's important to make sure, for your discussion especially, maybe, or for your discussion section especially, go through your results, with your mentors, and try to, if you can, address questions related to your research. They will have article suggestions and will help you with interpretation of those results, as well as they may be able to help you with outlining your discussion. When you're revising your first draft, there's some good resources on the WIP website. Also, you can find these resources on the course ELC. Now, I do want to note as well, if you are interested in working on writing or getting feedback on your writing, you're welcome to schedule a writing conference with me anytime before that draft is due, that final draft is due on reading day. I will note that we do have a peer review of the full draft. It's an optional peer review for the full draft of your research articles. We're going to be using a peer review guide as we have with past drafts. And I'll note that you don't actually need a full draft to participate. You can submit a draft at any stage and still participate in peer review. Your review to others and others' review of your draft will still be valuable. That is due on Wednesday, November 13th. That is a typo. It is November 13th on ELC, and I will send updates about that in the course ELC. I haven't actually uploaded this Dropbox yet, so I will send that out tomorrow on Thursday, the 7th of November. And again, if you're not in the bio 49X0R, you can still participate. Just email me. I do want to send one last reminder of the undergraduate writing retreat, which is this Sunday. Again, I really suggest going if you're available on Sunday. This is November 10th from 3 to 7 in the well-lit Miller Learning Center reading room. And again, it's just really nice to be around other people that are writing. I feel like that's, really just fosters productive and efficient atmosphere. Whenever I've done a writing retreat, I've gotten a lot done. This is a great timing to get your final draft, working on your final draft and maybe submitted for that peer review. All right. So that being said, want to take any questions. Thanks so much for coming out tonight, and you should be able to see the recording for this on the Writing Intensive website soon. Thanks so much, y'all.